First Lady Melania Trump is making her way through Ghana today. This is her first solo overseas trip. She toured the Cape Coast Castle. That's a former slave trading post.
The First Lady is promoting her Be Best campaign, focusing on child health care and education across the continent. She'll also travel to Malawi, Kenya, and Egypt this week. CBS News foreign correspondent Debora Patta has more.
Melania Trump arrived on her outreach to Africa as part of her Be Best campaign. She was welcomed in colourful style and greeted by Ghana's First Lady, Rebecca Akufo-Addo. Africa is well-travelled terrain for U.S. First Ladies.
Girls who are not being educated around
Michelle Obama focused on empowering young girls through leadership and education. Hillary Clinton highlighted U.S. support for African democracy.
Educated women.
And Laura Bush made many trips to the continent in support of her HIV and AIDS projects. Laura Bush's former chief of staff, Anita McBride, said often they were more popular than their husbands when traveling abroad.
Well, this is a perfect role for a First Lady of the United States, to really be a softening tone or a gentler tone and to build bridges.
Mending those bridges might well be the unspoken subtext of Melania Trump's African tour. As well as her husband's disparaging remarks about the region, many of her planned events highlight programs funded by U.S. aid, even though the Trump administration has proposed cuts to the organization's budget.
It may appear to be at odds with the president's overall policies, but it's important that she try and do what she can to sort of change that impression as much as she can.
Well, Debora Patta is with us now from Johannesburg. Debora, can you explain why the First Lady is in Africa, specifically why Ghana right now?
Well, as you've mentioned, this is her first solo trip, and it really is the traditional preserve of First Ladies. She's not the first First Lady, as you heard, to travel to this continent. Africa is a very popular choice for this goodwill gesture. It follows that traditional path, as many other First Ladies have. It's interesting what she chose to focus on: Ghana, Kenya, Malawi, and Egypt. So going to sort of all parts, north, south, east, and west, as it were, of this continent. Ghana specifically, she began with a look at some of the projects funded by USAID. She visited that clinic you saw, met with new mothers and their children. And today, I think, was the more emotional part of the trip, when she visited the East Coast castles, the Cape Coast castles, where the slave trade essentially was run from many, many years ago. And this was a very painful and sobering reminder of the United States' very painful history with slavery. This was regarded as the point of no return. Slaves would be held in captivity in these dungeons before being loaded like cargo onto ships and then sent away from their homeland forever, sent to America. So a very emotional time, I think, for Melania Trump as she visited there. But there was also some more recent and perhaps more positive reminders of the links between the two countries. I doubt that it would have escaped Melania Trump's notice that she would have had to have passed through a hall that is named after former President Obama. He also visited the area, and they named one of the halls after him. So Ghana, certainly an interesting choice, but an important one because of the links between America and the United States, the United States and Ghana.
And yet, Debora, as you mentioned in your piece there, this trip to Africa is out of step with her husband's policies. The First Lady is visiting many projects funded by USAID, which President Trump has tried to slash funding to. What are Africans saying about this visit? Do they feel that the First Lady can bring back some information that can really affect President Trump's policies, or is this a little bit of just window dressing?
Well, as you heard from the former chief of staff for Laura Bush, that essentially is the role they like to think. In the best possible circumstances, Melania Trump would visit Africa, return with positive news, and also do a lot to enhance the image and perhaps repair relations with this continent. The damage to this continent actually begins a while back. You'll recall earlier this year, President Trump made very disparaging, very belittling comments about this region, referring to them as expletive whole countries. And that has stuck in this continent. So many of the countries she's visiting, people are saying Melania Trump is going to have to overcome her husband's baggage of these disparaging comments. But as you mentioned, Vlad, Melania Trump's itinerary is also out of step with some of Trump's own policies, the U.S. aid projects that he wants to slash funding to, the focus on children, when perhaps that has not always been the primary focus of the Trump administration. The example that is held up by critics is President Trump's decision to separate mothers from their children along the Mexican border. She will be going to Kenya, where they'll be focusing on wildlife conservation. And again, President Trump has relaxed some of the legislation regarding trophy hunting. So there is kind of concern around this. Obviously, Melania Trump and her entourage will be hoping to spread a more gentle image, to spread an image that America is open to all these cultures. But there is a lot of damage to overcome on this continent, and in particular, those disparaging comments made by Trump.
So, Debora, moving forward, what can we expect from the First Lady's stops in Malawi, Kenya, and Egypt?
Well, Melania Trump has billed this as part of her Be Best campaign, which is focusing on cyberbullying and the welfare of children. So in Malawi, when she goes there tomorrow, she will be looking at education, at literacy. There'll also be a sort of traditional meet and greet at the embassy. In Kenya, as I mentioned, it's wildlife conservation and also a significant focus on HIV and AIDS projects. Again, a lot of these projects are funded by USAID, so it'll be interesting to see what she comes up with there. And then finally, in Egypt, the other things that I've mentioned, children and health, will be part of her focus there, but also looking at tourism. So quite a wide range, a diverse number of issues that the First Lady will be addressing. But overall, they're billing this as a goodwill gesture, following the traditional path of First Ladies before her.
You know, we should just point out also, when the reason I asked the question about the window dressing, Debora, is, as you know, this is not a red or blue issue. President George W. Bush invested a lot in Africa, and in fact, just as recently as last year, wrote an op-ed suggesting that we should not cut funding for some of the programs that he established during his presidential administration, including programs like the Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which has helped millions of people across the continent.
Indeed, Vlad, and you know, Laura Bush herself made frequent trips to this continent, and HIV/AIDS was her #1 priority when she visited here. This is a continent that is reeling from HIV/AIDS and is still battling to cope with the disease and with the consequences of that disease, and needing that emergency relief so very desperately. So to cut back on US aid projects, particularly the ones that focus on HIV/AIDS that began all those years ago, would be a serious setback for this continent. So the hope is obviously that, you know, perhaps Melania Trump could take something back, but so far it seems that her husband's mind is made up on this. That legislation and that plan, rather, to slash those budgets has not yet been approved, but it's certainly in the offering, and it's certainly something that the administration is pushing very, very hard for.
All right, Debora Patta in Johannesburg. Thank you so much, Debora.